All right, for the sake of the panel now, we'd love to know who's in the room. So would you raise your hand if you're a grower or farmer of some kind? Amazing. And what about if you're a retailer? Any retailers in the room? Fantastic. Wholesalers? Spattering. Processing? Anyone involved in processing? Amazing. All right, fantastic. Thank you so much. That really helps to kind of set the scene a little bit. So everyone in the tent today is likely to be here because we believe farming with nature and for our soils is a necessity for a resilient food system. And yet the current extractive supply chain places all of the power in the hands of a small number of retailers, with farmers getting far too little for their produce. For the last few years at Sustain, we've been running a program called Bridging the Gap, which has been exploring how we can make organic and agroecological fruit and veg more accessible to people of all incomes. We have been trialling approaches in the public sector procurement space and in local retail spaces through pilots across the UK. Unsurprisingly, I think we already predicted this when we started the programme, that supply chains kind of hold the key. And that has been reinforced by work we've been doing on a growth plan for local food. So we wanted to explore here today what the opportunities were to make changes to our supply chains that would be fairer to farmers and fairer to people. Citizens. So we appreciate this is a vast topic. We can't cover everything, but we really want to dig into some of the most practical elements of the challenge. And we have some fantastic panelists joining us today, so I'll just introduce them very briefly before we get the conversation started. So Julia Kirby Smith is Executive Director of Better Food Traders, a non-profit community interest company that empowers and equips communities, local authorities, farmers and traders to rebuild independent, sustainable food sector. Katie Palmer is the founder and head of Food Sense Wales. Most recently, Katie has led the development of the Welsh Veg in Schools programme, which has been partly funded by Bridging the Gap and the Welsh Government. Josiah Meldrum is the co-founder of Hodmedod, a Suffolk company whose aim is to encourage us to grow and eat a wider range of British-grown pulses, grains and seeds. And Patrick Holden is the founder and CEO of the Sustainable Food Trust, whose mission is to work internationally to accelerate the transition towards sustainable food and farming systems. Patrick, let's start with you. Last time we met and were on a panel together, we were talking about carrots. So I'd like to start with carrots again. Could you tell us a little bit about the challenges that were presented to you when you were first originally growing carrots that made you stop growing carrots and why you started growing them again?
Sorry about that. Yes, I think our experience is a bit of a case study. I started growing carrots in 1979 and grew them for 25 years, supplying initially Whole Food shops in London, but then supermarkets. And after 25 years, we were supplying Waitrose and Sainsbury's. We were growing about 8 or 9 acres of carrots a year. But then the supermarkets moved all their packing houses mainly to the eastern counties because it was more economically profitable for them to have just one pack house per vegetable. And the last pack house standing was just outside Peterborough, 230 miles from our farm. So we tried to make that work and gave up rather noisily in 2006. It was a piece in The Guardian, and there was quite a lot of discussion about it. And then for 18 years, we didn't grow carrots. And then last year, Food Sense Wales and Castell Hall, who are a food distribution company in Wales, and others approached us and said, would you grow carrots again? And we were a bit once bitten, twice shy, because we'd been there and done it, and we got rid of the equipment and everything. And so I said, what's the deal? And there's a man called Ed Morgan, who's really an amazing national treasure of Wales, who works for Castell Hall. And the answer was, we'll give you a guaranteed price for your carrots, £1.60 a kilogram, which is a high price if you know the price of carrots. And we will collect them from your farm, and we'll get them washed and packed and distributed in the collaboration with the Welsh Veg in Schools Collaborative, which I think now has 14, is it maybe more members? And I said, okay, we're in. We grew an acre last year, and it went well. And And this year we're growing 2 acres, and it's very, very weedy at the moment. And so I shouldn't really be here. I should be weeding carrots. But I think what is really interesting about this project is that I've had an email exchange with Ed Morgan just in the last 48 hours. And if you look at where that £1.60 a kilo is coming from, it's coming from the funders of the project, and there are too few of them. And Casteth Howell themselves, and largely because the man who owns the company believes that conventionally grown veg are compromising the health of the children of Wales. He's in for the long term, but they can't afford to finance it on their own. And the Welsh government have put quite a lot of money into it, but I think they're putting too much money in as well. So what we really need is a wider coalition of people who will co-finance the agricultural transition. And also, we shouldn't underestimate the technical challenges, just practical challenges of relocalizing food systems, whether it's washing them, grading them, distributing them. All that infrastructure used to exist when I was growing carrots before. It was a pack house in Wales, and it was just down the road from us. And in fact, the first carrots that organic carrots that Sainsbury's ever sold were packed in our cowshed in 1985, and that would not be legal now, and because there are too many bacteria. So, long story cut short, I think we are a very, very interesting case study, and we are only growing the carrots because of the generosity of a few people and the brilliance of Food Sense Wales and all the people in the coordination of the project. And I think it's very relevant to now because lots of people would like to relocalise their food system. It's really hard.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Patrick, for that introduction. So, Josiah, from carrots to pulses, you have built a farmer-focused supply chain around UK-grown pulses. Can you tell us a little bit about what motivated you to do that, why you felt it was necessary, and how you've grown the business?
Yeah, I mean, I think to be clear, Nick, myself, and William, who co-founded Hodmedod, prior to starting the business in 2012, we've been working for non-governmental organisations. We've been doing consultancy work for farmers. We've been doing policy work, policy advocacy work for everything from local to national government, really trying to agitate for what we're now calling the agricultural transition, that fair and equitable shift from one system to another that supports farmers and supports the environment and supports our health. And we were asked in 2008 whether, by a community group in Norwich, whether the city could feed itself and what that might do to diet and to land use. And we looked at horticultural production, we looked at livestock production, and we looked at cereal production. And we also looked at pulse crops because they're a critical part of building soil nutrition, building soil carbon, moving away from synthetic fertilizers, but also a really important part of a diet that fits with a land use model that we probably need to be shifting towards. And the thing that we found really interesting in that conversation was that within the local food sector, within the conversations that happen about local food, there's a lot of focus on what we would describe as the kind of charismatic elements of the rotation. So horticultural crops, people can really easily engage with them. You can see them growing, you can grow them in your garden, you can build a relationship with those crops. Livestock obviously are charismatic for all sorts of reasons. They're beautiful sentient creatures, and you can see them in the fields. But the arable crops, actually the crops that mostly feed us, the crops that are producing the bread that we eat, the pulse crops, they're really difficult for people to engage with because they happen at a scale which is really difficult for communities to become involved with. And we got really interested in this part of the food system that is largely anonymous on our plates. You might go out for a meal and, ask where the meat came from or who grew the vegetables, but people very rarely think about who produced the grain that made the bread that they're eating beside that, or where the rice came from, who grew that rice, what was the life opportunity for the people that are in those rice fields. So we felt it was really important to shine a light on arable crops, which make up about 5 million hectares in the UK every year, and broadly are a bit of a disaster if we're really honest about it, and we need to change that system. And we felt that the answer was to start with pulses, put pulses back in the centre of the rotation rather than as the annoying break crop that's low value and high risk, to think about direct routes to market which support farmers properly, be incredibly transparent about that production system. One of the big rewards, I think, for the farmers we work with is, and it seems quite small, but it makes a massive difference, is seeing their names on the packet, because it's very rare for an arable farmer to see their name on a product that has come from their farm. It's much easier to do that with meat and with vegetables. And broadly over the last 10 years that the business Hodmedod has been established, because we found that doing the community work was brilliant, but the scale of the operation for Arable was never going to happen through that Norwich Community Group. We established a business in 2012 to really agitate actively for this refocused supply system around pulses. And what we've begun to develop is what we call, instead of a supply chain, I know we're talking about chains, I feel that chains enslave us and we need to break these chains, that we need to be thinking about relational networks of supply where everyone can talk to each other, where we get really fast feedback of information, where knowledge is shared between consumers and food writers and journalists and academics and farmers, because otherwise we're not gonna get that feedback that we need that allows change to happen really, really quickly. So we know that the food system is transactional. We buy and we sell things. It's an economic relationship, but it also needs to be relational, and we need to move away from the purely transactional, because that has got us into a hell of a mess over the last 70 years.
Brilliant. Well, actually, Katie, maybe I'll come to you then on this idea of relational networks of supply. How has that come to play in establishing Welsh Veg in schools and the programme that you've been working on over the last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, it's been absolutely fundamental, the relationships in the supply chain, and it's really, I guess, out of everything, it's central to what we've been doing is building the relationships back into the supply chain. So Welsh Veg in Schools is really working with everybody from policymakers through to the farmers, and then working with the farmers and rebuilding those connections between the farmers and the wholesalers. But the farmers and the catering managers in the school, we get everybody in a room together, and also Castle Howe, the wholesaler, and the children and the catering managers and the catering managers and the growers. So we kind of create this melting pot of everybody that's involved in the supply chain. Just bring it back very quickly to carrots quickly, and I wanted to touch on why the public sector is really important in this space. But a great quote from Ed Morgan from Castle Howe is talking about the price of food, is that the most expensive carrot is the carrot you can't get. And for quite a while last year, during the season, carrots, or when carrots are slightly out of season, carrots were being imported in from China, because that was the closest place in the supply chain. So our children were eating carrots from China, which was not great. But I think, the public sector has a really important role to play in helping to redesign supply chains, because not necessarily because of the value of public sector contracts, but because of the principle. Certainly in Wales, nearly a third of the working age population works in the public sector. Public sector feed the most vulnerable people in society, whether that's children, whether that's people in our hospitals and in prisons, and we also then feed those people who are working to support those most vulnerable people in society. So there's a real, requirement for government to step up to properly be investing in systems. And often when we talk to the children about Welsh Veg in Schools, as a parent myself, I want to know that my child is eating food which is great for them, but is also not damaging their future by damaging the planet. So it's very much focusing on those added values that you're getting from investing in the supply chain, investing in the relationships. But that's very much got to happen at that local level, and then leaning into the existing systems that are already in place. So in the case of Welsh Veg in Schools, we're working with those wholesalers, and Castle Howe has been the champion in this space, but we're also working with other wholesalers now as well that are supplying into the school contracts already. So we're trying to say to those wholesalers, look, you can be providing this food into the schools. We can be helping to secure a more resilient supply chain for Wales, because at the moment we're hardly growing any veg in Wales at all. We're growing less than a quarter of a portion of veg per head of population a day. So we need to be growing more, and we need to not be importing fruit and veg from water-starved countries, climate-vulnerable countries, where we can be producing that ourselves in this country.
Brilliant, thank you, Katie. Let's move from procurement space to retail then with you, Julia. You've obviously, Better Food Traders been supporting retailers who want to source regeneratively and fairly. What do you see as some of the best models for doing this that you've come across? How can they hope to kind of diversify the retail space?
Thanks for the question. So to set the scene a little bit, for those who don't know us, Better Food Traders is an organisation that is essentially a membership organisation. So we currently have 200 plus trader members, all of whom are united in selling organic produce of some kind, but we have a massive range of business models. So our members include bricks and mortar shops, online food hubs, farmers markets, veg box schemes, and wholesalers, so a real diversity. And really we act as we help people kind of upskill, and we support those enterprises with all sorts of training and networking opportunities. And what we're seeing, I'll give you sort of 3 examples very briefly where we can see it working. And I think it is about what Josiah just talked about, this idea of a network of supply. So one being Bristol Community Farm. They are a small farm. They grow on about 14 acres. It's all horticulture. But they established, based on the fact that they were supplying into Better Food, which is a network of shops. They have 4 shops in Bristol, 4 independent grocery stores and cafes. And that original supply into those shops gave them the grounding to be able to know that they could always sell some wholesale. They could also provide veg boxes locally and deliver. And they've kind of built their business model from that, and they now do other bits of wholesale, and they've built onto their veg boxes lots and lots of other products. So they're the amazing, gorgeous array of sort of groceries. But it's that kind of symbiosis between supply and demand, really, and that network of different suppliers who are supplying into that box and kind of going through their business. Likewise, the Better Food Shed in London, which is part of Growing Communities. The Better Food Shed is a non-profit wholesaler that actually supplies, I think, about 20 plus veg box schemes all around London, but also supplies and sources from Growing Communities. They've got small numbers of growing spaces in peri-urban spaces around London, and equally Growing Communities has its veg box scheme. So there's this kind of this ecosystem of supply and demand that are making these things work. Now those are quite hard things to set up. Another project that we're working on currently is we're supporting a cohort of 12 what we're calling regional food hubs. And these are all enterprises that are looking to basically work at a kind of wholesale hub sort of level, at a regional level, and act as that strategic entity that will allow small scale growers and farmers to supply into slightly bigger markets. So a great example from that is Ox Farm to Fork, where you've got Oxford colleges actually buying from this supply chain, which sources from multiple small producers all around Oxfordshire. So it's those networks, those relationships, and they take time to build, but that is what we need to see.
Fantastic. Thank you all for those great examples. I'm immediately thinking about scale. So I suppose all of these are fantastic examples of things that can be done. But how do we scale these to make it really viable for a larger scale implementation in the future? Patrick, I can see you're keen to jump in. Then I'll go to Josiah after you.
May I first? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there are 3 barriers to scale. The first I've already mentioned is finance. If it doesn't pay, farmers and growers can't do it. And finance includes financing the infrastructure, not only the machinery, because I had to borrow all the machinery to go back into carrot production from, luckily, I've got some friends and neighbours who lent it to us, but if they weren't there, I couldn't have done it. But the infrastructure, that's all gone as well. And that is really expensive. So we really need to think about how we can put together I agree with you. We shouldn't call it supply chains. That's industrial language. We need to use cultural language to describe what this is, because it's a cultural revolution. And if we use industry language, it gives the wrong image. But I think that a big barrier is also demand. And we had, you mentioned it, about schools, and we had the children from our local primary school on our farm last September in the carrot field, and Ceredigion, which is the county I farm in, wasn't in this Welsh Virgin Schools project. It was only Carmarthenshire. And the children from Ysgolor, which is our local primary school, came into our carrot field. They picked carrots, which I think may be illegal in terms of what you're allowed to do, by the way. There's a fascinating thing about the illegality of food. So we have to be BRC accredited, which means an animal may not have been in the field for at least a year, which, if you think about it, is a bit strange if you're an organic farmer and a cow farmer. And what about bird shit? But they don't think about that. So animal manures, and there's a lot of barriers, and actually regulatory barriers is one of them. Anyway, the children picked the carrots, ate the carrots, and then they went back to the school and they said, why isn't Ceredigion part of this project? So the children of the school lobbied the local council to ask whether Ceredigion could come in. As a result of the children's lobbying, they came in. So I think demand and getting people behind it is really important. The third barrier, I think, is to do with recognizing the difference, because most of the carrots that people are eating today come from industrial carrot monocultures, mainly in the fens, which are terrible for climate. And our carrots are more nutrient dense. I know that because Castell Hal did an analysis of them. And there's a guy called Dan Kitteridge here at Groundswell who's doing some amazing work on measuring nutrient density. He's going to be at our farm, by the way, if you want to come in here and begin the weekend after next. And I think we need to get out there the fact that if you grow carrots in a proper crop rotation, you can't grow them more than once every 7 years, with a proper fertility building phase, the carrot's going to be way, way better and more nutrient dense. And so we've got to get that message across to the public. Otherwise, with this can't, because in the end, it's about demand. And the Chinese carrot's the perfect example. We need an expensive, a properly priced carrot to be demanded by people who understand the difference.
Thank you, Patrick. Very clear summary of 3 points there. And I was wondering, from Hodmedod's perspective, when you're faced with those different challenges, infrastructure and finance, demand, recognising the difference, is there anything else there that's missing for you in terms of scaling and maintaining the integrity of the business and the approach that you wanted to take?
Yeah, I mean, we have a similar but different set of challenges, and one of those is the scale at which those crops are grown. So pulse crops, for example, to be worthwhile for a farmer, they have to fill about a field full. In East Anglia, a field is quite big, and that is a lot of pulses that need to be eaten. If we harvest 60 tons of pulses, which may not seem very much to an individual farmer at the scale that they might be working with in East Anglia, that's a lot of eaters that need to be found to eat that crop. And making that match happen, building demand, as you rightly say, for that crop. Post-harvest, there are all sorts of other challenges. There's been, much as there's been consolidation in the seed sector and in the agrochemical sector, there's been huge consolidation in seed cleaning, and the seed cleaning is critical to getting the pulses, but also the other seeds that we sell and the cereals fit for human consumption. So it's a real challenge working with small loads. And the unit of measure for most farmers, as the farmers in the room will know, is really 28 tons, which is a full load. And any less than that, it starts to get expensive because you're working with capped loads where you pay a full fee, or you're working in tote bags, which is really, really fiddly and annoying. And then you've got to persuade a cleaner to be patient with you and say, yeah, I know your minimum order quantity is 100 tons, but we've only got 5. What can you do for us? And that is a real challenge. So that infrastructure is missing, and actually purchasing that, financing that equipment would be really, really expensive. We reckon it would cost, you can do simple on-farm cleaning, splitting, say, pulses from a cereal from a bicrop, which is brilliant, but the final cleaning, ready for human consumption, you need a site that can meet BRC considerations. On the bird shit front, we were once asked to map migratory birds over a field. So they
and by the way, there are more birds on organic farms. Tricky.
But yeah, and we reckon to do that properly, you might need to invest £6 million, and finding that money. Oxfarm to Fork, for example, that's a brilliant project, and we're looking at how we can work with them in order to enable pulse crops to become part of the offer. But the Oxford colleges they work with are not going to generate enough demand to make it worthwhile a farmer growing a specific crop for them. So we need to think about how we work as a network, and we've done that with Bridging the Gap as well. And I think it's really critical that we start thinking about these structural issues. Some of that is about social capital. It's about how we relate to each other. Some of it is about the physical capital that is missing.
Is social capital a positive or a negative? Because everybody's been stripping out employment out of these food systems. They're a social positive, and we should measure that and value it.
Yeah, absolutely. On the demand side, obviously, from a retail perspective, how are we going to drive greater demand for these smaller, more independent, closer to the consumer retail options, away from maybe the largest supermarket models that don't create that close connection with farmers? Yeah,
so it's important to remember that people choose food. I think, we talk about these 4 ways that people choose. It's price, convenience, culture, and taste. And so we've got to make local regenerative food hit all of those 4 things. Some of that, I think, can be done through just making that customer experience better. The array of e-commerce technology has made it so much easier for people to sell food, but they need the skills to do that. That's partly why we come in as Better Food Traders as an organisation, sort of upskilling, whether it's farmers or traders, so they can sell their produce. But you've got to also do it in a way that is then appealing and talks about taste. And we do know that actually consumers are willing to spend that bit more when they understand the value, when they understand what organic means, some of the sustainability issues. And we know that price isn't necessarily the thing that actually, your most committed organic consumers, for instance, are often people on lower incomes, and they're not the kind of stereotypical wealthy, bougie middle classes that we might think. So there's a lot to play for in terms of what consumers, people who are demanding more sustainable food, but we have to meet them where they are in terms of convenience. And I think some of that comes through also just creating an offer that people want to buy. So, if you're selling a veg box, what can you add into it? Can you add pulses, eggs, cheese, toilet paper, cleaning products? It's how do we make these this retail offer of this sort of food much more easy and attractive for people to get to. And the other side of it as well is just marketing. It's, we're up against a supermarket system that has huge budgets to spend on a lot of foods that are frankly really bad for people. And I think we need to balance that. I'd like to see government spending going towards back to 5 a day, back to some of the messaging around what people need to be eating and not to be shy of those messages. And then, for small retailers to be bold about how they market themselves and make sure that they get out there and they find their customers.
Thank you. Speaking of government putting their money behind some of these moves in the right direction, Katie, obviously that was a part of the incentive behind getting Welsh Veg and schools off the ground, was put public money for public goods concept. How do you see that scaling from your perspective in Welsh Veg and schools?
Well, what we did with Welsh Veg and schools was that we used basically a policy that Welsh Government had introduced, which was universal free school meals for all primary school children, and at the same time looking to increase the amount of local food that was going into those school meals. So we basically leveraged that policy commitment, programme for government commitment, to say, well, actually, Welsh Government, if you want to be supplying local food into local schools, we need to be producing it in the first place. And as I mentioned earlier, we're just not producing enough veg. So it was all about, I think this is where we've used public procurement to look at how we manage risk in the system, because at the moment, when you're looking at, I don't know what words to use now, not supply chains, but when you're looking at, I'm going to use it anyway. When you're looking at supply chains, if you're looking at growing a field of carrots, where does that risk sit? All of that risk and investment sits with the grower. And that's not fair, because actually the benefit ultimately should sit with the person that ends up eating the carrot. So it's how do you actually look at spreading that risk across the whole of that network of people that are invested in where that carrot ends up. And so the work that we've been doing has been saying, right, we're going to give you a secure market. We're going to plug the gap between the cost of the veg that's coming through conventional supply chains at the moment and locally grown veg. You'll get that price. If you produce more, then the system, as it has been set up, that actually Castle Howell have said, well, actually, we'll take it and we'll put it into our other markets. And the advantage of that is then it goes into other markets like the hospitality sector or other parts of the public sector where other people get to taste and experience the product. Or if there's a problem with production, and it has been challenging over the last couple of years with the weather conditions, then Castle Howell can draw on their conventional supply chain. So we've been able to take the risk out of the system, which has then been given the confidence to growers to A, come on board, but B, to start to expand. So we've got some of the growers who are really expanding it, quite rapidly. We've also got growers who may be conventional farmers and are just taking a little bit of their land to test and see what it's like to grow organic veg. So by taking that risk out, it's really helping. But as Patrick said, we have to fund that. We have to find a way of resourcing that to enable those farmers to grow, to get more farmers growing fruit and veg, and getting to a scale and the level of investment in infrastructure that we need in order to make the sums add up into the future. And the other thing that I guess I just want to say on this subject as well is that it's really important that the children actually want to eat the food at the end of it. There's no point in us producing it if the kids are then, and it's ending up in the bin. So it's really important that we're wrapping around the whole of the system with education as well, and that we're working with the children, that they have a say and they're invested in what's happening, which is why it's really important what's happened on Patrick's farm. And Patrick, last week we were in a recording studio down the road from you with 4 children from the school that you mentioned earlier, recording a podcast which is going to be launched today, I think, which actually tells their story of how they've got involved in Welsh Veg in schools. So that will be a nice resource to listen to.
I'll do listen out for that. Katie, let us know by the end where we can listen to it. So we'd like to take some questions from you now. So if you have a question, please do raise your hand. If you could introduce yourself and your question as briefly as possible so we can get through as many as possible in the time we've got available. And Nikki here will come and find you with the mic. So keep your hand raised so she can find you. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Georgia Vampiri, Sustainable and Circular Food System Strategies from Greece. I have a question regarding the supply chain and the end product. We are speaking about the demand of the end user, the consumer, as a persona who demand more organic, more sustainable, more locally, high nutritious products at the end. But I'm wondering if we want truly to speak about sustainable products and cover both the environmental aspect and the socioeconomic, at the end of the day, the product, the food, has to be produced within environmental friendly ways, in an ethical way, mean fair salaries, wages to the producers, and it has to be affordable. I understand, though, that until we reach this point and make regen ag, agroecology, you name it, mainstream, we have steps to follow. But I'm wondering, what is the thought on this? I mean, on the long run, how to make it the end product sustainable holistically, and not only thinking the persona of the consumer who demands and can afford to pay for it.
Thank you very much. So, Patrick, I know you've done a lot on thinking about sort of true cost accounting and how we account for the different externalities within the price of food. Do you want to just kick us off a little bit of an introduction with that, and then I'll just check in with everybody else?
Yes, I think this is a really important question, because if it costs more to produce food in a climate, nature, and people-friendly way, or rather, it shouldn't cost more if there was an honest economic system, but because the polluter doesn't pay and we don't get public money for public goods, it seems to cost more at the moment. What would put that right? And I think if every farm in the UK and the world was measured using a common framework of measurement, looking at its climate impact, its nature impact, biodiversity and everything else, natural capital, but also its social impacts, including right livelihood, animal welfare, nutrient density, public health. And if that information could appear as some kind of sustainability score on a label, and it was trusted, I think the finance would come from people who have an interest in supporting this change. I'm just giving you one example. If it is true, and I think Brian Jones, the owner of Castell Howell, thinks this is true, that if we invested in sustainable agriculture, we would save on NHS treatment costs, then surely that would be a good source of money to invest in sustainable agriculture. And I just looked at the sums last week. DEFRA are putting 2.7 billion into the Sustainable Farming Scheme initiative this year. They're spending the government is spending 202 billion on the National Disease Treatment Service. So there needs to be a rethinking of that. And then in terms of climate, farmers could sequester carbon in their soils. And in terms of nature, we could be paid for our biodiversity gain in the fields. So I think we need to measure sustainability, including the social impacts, monetize it, and then find a way to communicate it to the public on food labels as well. And we are involved with a project called the Global Farm Metric, which is not an auditing scheme. People like Soil Association Exchange are doing a brilliant job on that. We just think everybody should measure in a common way, because then it would sort out the confusion.
Thanks. Aside from then measurement and this beautiful ideal of a true cost accounting approach, what are the other ways that we're seeing immediately in the near future for bringing prices down and making it more affordable for everybody?
Can I come in there?
Yeah.
I really don't think prices should come down, to be honest. Food prices in the UK are relatively among the lowest in Europe, and people are constantly told this narrative about cheap food, which I think probably comes from a post World War II mentality. But that's part of the problem. Obviously, yes, there are people who are experiencing poverty and food then becomes difficult, but they're experiencing poverty for many structural reasons, and it's about the overheads of people's lives. It's not that food is expensive. So I think a big part of the challenge is to reawaken that debate about the value of food, and to make people, be willing to spend a little bit more, as they do in France and Italy and many other countries. And for people who are not living in poverty, it's a choice, right? Do you want to go on a really nice holiday, or do you want to buy the cheapest possible food, or do you want to just readjust that balance? And I think what's interesting actually is some of the consumer research shows that there is a generational difference. So younger people are tending to be more mindful about spending a little bit more money on products where they see that sustainability value or that ethical value. So they will buy some of those items, like an organic chicken, for instance, is quite a good example. People will buy an organic chicken rarely, and then eat pulses and other protein forms the rest of the time, and that's a sort of generational shift. That's where I feel we need to get to.
So if we're agreed that we do not want to be devaluing our food as an absolute priority, then I guess where it's harder to make the choice, where people are experiencing lower incomes, what are the support mechanisms that we need to put in place to make sure this good food is available to more people? Katie, do you have any initial thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the obvious place for children is in schools, which is why it's so important that children are being provided with the best quality food that they possibly can be, and that would then come down to the public sector. I think also there's other opportunities to think about things differently. I think we've got to be thinking much more about seasonal eating, which allows us then also to reduce costs in that supply chain, because you're reducing the number of different people, food miles and all the rest of it. I think, eating from much more of a local area is helpful. And I think a lot of work that food partnerships are doing to look at community food resilience and looking at different ways in which local food can be accessed by communities much more directly. The sort of work that's happening in Nourish Scotland around looking at the social diner model, where you're actually looking at working with the private sector in more of a kind of a social enterprise model to make food more affordable, but then potentially is subsidised by the public sector as well. And I think it's really, really important that we kind of have the essentials. We've heard about essentials guarantee, that we're looking that we have this basket of food that is healthy and that is readily available, affordable for people to access. Things like the Healthy Start programme, which provides fruit and veg, or money for fruit and veg, and it's Best Start in Scotland. That's accessible to the right people, because currently, that's not got a wide enough eligibility, and also the value is not sufficient. So how do we make sure that that's addressed? We've seen in England the extension of free school meals coming out now to people who are on universal credit. That's a really good area. But then government need to make sure that the food that's going into those school meals is of the right quality, and using that public sector purse really to help drive up standards and infrastructure and all the rest of it that's needed to expand the sort of production that we want to see.
Thank you. Let's take another question. Please raise your hand if you've got another question to ask. Oh, hiya.
Hi, this is Alex from Soil Capital. Do we need regenerative certifications to fuel the regenerative supply chain, to fuel the interest of consumers to buy those regenerative products? And if we do use them, how do we do that in a way that doesn't create a new niche, that doesn't invite all farmers to adopt regenerative practices?
Thank you. Josiah, can I start with you on certifications and what role they play?
To start with, we don't actually use the word regenerative. I don't feel that it has particular meaning. I mean, we see it on the farm and we know what it is and we can recognise it, but it's really hard to capture it in a sentence and to put it anywhere, because it means different things in different contexts and it's worked in different ways. The certification we use is organic. Not all of our farmers are organic, though. And the key thing that we ask of all of the farmers we work with is that they're keen on continual change and looking to do things differently and improve things. In terms of, I don't have a particular opinion on regenerative agriculture for certification. I think it probably needs time to settle in and work out what it is, and that maybe needs another 10 or 15 years perhaps. But I do think there need to be measurements in the way that Patrick is talking so that we can recognise what change looks like. And I think it's really important broadly that we think beyond the farm gate. I think the problem with regenerative farming is that it puts things on the farm only. It makes change the responsibility of the farmer, and it's the responsibility of all of us collectively. And we need to think agroecologically. We need to think in a systems way about how we affect social change, cultural change, and farming change. And that will, I think, affect an economic shift. I mean, I think our food, for example, the things that we sell are affordable and they're actually quite cheap. You can buy a packet of beans for less than a cup of coffee and it will feed 10 people. And I think we do need to reframe the way we think about what we're eating and how we're eating it. And I also think that if we do build a relational system of supply, you're much less likely to feel inclined to rip off your friend, and you're much more likely to see value in what they're doing. And I think it's so important that because we've become so detached from where our food has come from, it's really easy to isolate ourselves from the people that are actually growing it.
I'll come to you in a minute, Patrick. How do your traders deal with that and this idea of a regenerative certification? Does that feel valuable and important?
I would say, so in the Better Food Traders Network, we use organic as the standard. I mean, I think regenerative is clearly, it's a useful term for bringing people on a journey, I think, but to my mind, that journey should lead to organic, because it is a legal framework that is well established and people understand it. I mean, that's controversial, I don't know, but it feels like, why do we need another set of labels and another framework when we have organic? But perhaps regenerative is useful because it is that broader church. So it's perhaps a way to kind of be inclusive of people that are not ready to take that step.
Patrick, you wanted to come in.
Well, I agree with what you both said, but I think it's really important that we shouldn't create another schism between organic and regenerative. And I think the way to bridge that, because you could say I'm a little bit responsible for that polarization because I was so involved with the organic project, but I think if we all measured using a common framework, including organic farmers, because if I'm really honest, if I'm asked, how is your farm doing? I want to know whether my farming system is delivering on climate and on nature and on people, but because I haven't been measuring, I don't actually know. So I think if we all had a sustainability score on our farms, then that could find expression in food products and it would bridge the gap, because I think the regenerative, I mean, look what's happening here at Groundswell, it's unbelievable. And lots of farmers here are not organic, which is brilliant because they're making steps. But we need to somehow make sense of it all with a common way of measuring, and I think that would be the reconciling solution.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think the challenge we have is that we work with organic certification because we're supplying into the schools and we want to be really clear that the product that they're getting is the highest quality product, that it's meeting the biodiversity targets. And it's the only way really you can do that at the moment is by organic certification. But it is one of my huge personal frustrations that it is a limiting factor of the project, because you have to pay for the certification, and we shouldn't be having to pay for doing the right things. And I think that's just that system is upside down, and that's what needs to be addressed.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question down here.
Hi, my name's Ros Savage, and I'm the Member of Parliament for the South Cotswolds. It's a rural constituency and also the home of the Royal Agricultural University. We're shortly to launch a project called Stronger South Cotswolds, which is very much about making our communities more resilient in the face of future shocks, environmental, economic, political. And one of our goals is to shorten food supply chains. So my question for the panel is quite a large one. So maybe this is, maybe I'll just hit you up afterwards for a meeting later. About 40,000 households in my constituency. Is it feasible to do this, to shorten those food supply chains, given the lack of infrastructure? Maybe you can give me some pointers as to what we could do, maybe based on Welsh Veg in schools, in order to bring food producers and food customers closer together.
Katie, let's come to you first on that then.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my first pointer would be find the local food partnership in your area. I guess that there may well be more than one, and there's some excellent case studies of where this kind of work is happening across the Sustainable Food Places Network, which is a network of over 120 places across the UK that's driving this place-based approach and really looking at how you bring suppliers and consumers much closer together. So that would be my top tip, would be to seek out your sustainable food partnership, of which I'm guessing there's one in your area. And then certainly, there's examples. For example, we've got a place in Wales where the county there's actually a county farm. The county farm have been involved in Welsh Veg in Schools. In fact, they provided the carrot washer for Welsh Veg in Schools, and that farm has only been going just over a year now, and they're producing food for Welsh Veg in Schools, so it's going into schools in the local community, but also involved in supplying into care homes and working with other kind of community projects as well in the area. So there's lots of great examples of where it is being done.
Josiah, you obviously started with Norwich feeding itself.
Yeah. So I think the key thing to say is, what do we mean when we say short supply chain? Do we mean proximate, or do we mean limited, a small number of connections between farm to eater? And I think what we mean is the connection between farm or food producer and eater. And actually, that doesn't necessarily mean hyper-localization. And certainly for some of the arable crops, that would be really difficult. And it would be difficult to imagine how you could produce all the food in your region that you want to eat. So, for example, at Hodmedod, we formed a direct connection with the Kayapo people in the Brazilian Amazon to buy Brazil nuts from them directly in order to support their fight to defend the forest. And that is a connection that is very real. We are connected to them, and we can connect our customers to them, and we can tell the story of the plight of the forest and of the people that live in the forest. So I think when you're thinking about short supply chains, don't necessarily just think about proximity, think about the relationship that you're forming.
The Sustainable Food Trust and Sustain, along with Better Food Traders, were recently involved in developing a growth plan for local food. So, Julia, would you just like to share a little bit, and then I'll come to you, Patrick, for a final word on this?
Yes, the growth plan. Well, can I just say there was something I wanted to comment. We've talked a lot, I guess we're at a farming conference, so we talked about the sort of farming and production side, but the other element that I think is really important and interesting when you're talking about place-based food approaches is that there was some really interesting research by Power to Change recently that showed that in places with declining high streets, you get a greater tendency for people to vote for right-wing and populist parties. So there's a real politicization here where you see that visible local decline is being tied to how people feel about their place. And food can play such a big part in that as well. Whether it's independent grocery stores being on the high street, or a mobile vegetable van, or it's these sorts of visible things that people can be proud of that make them feel, food is part of my local culture. I think that's a really interesting place that food retail and farmers, can raise visibility and have that role. And the local food growth plan, I mean, it's a really exciting document. Better Food Traders were heavily involved in it, along with many, many other partners. And yeah, I mean, it's plotting out a route to how do we grow local food. A lot of it was around networks of supply, yes, visible food retail, also marketing. You know, we have to, going back to this, we have to think about public communications, but also marketing, and really sort of enabling and giving local traders the confidence to get out there and talk about their benefits, their values, their delicious food. You know, you've got to be selling it on these. It's basically got to be delicious. That's really important.
Thanks, Julia. Did you want to come in, Patrick, with a final word?
Only to say, I think that conversation is so important to work out what infrastructure is needed to make it all work. Small abattoirs, we've campaigned on them. They're still disappearing. So we need, and that's really important, because you can't have local meat unless you have local abattoirs. But it's the equivalent with processing for dairying, washing vegetables, distributing them. But I think Josiah's nailed it. We all need to know the story behind our food, and we're the ones that can make a difference. If we buy preferentially food with a known story behind it, and we avoid food with no known story, then we can be the change. And I think what everyone's doing here is amazing. I think we are the change.
Brilliant, thank you. So just a final question, that I'm going to direct the same question to each of you before we close up. We have a government working on the National Food Strategy at the moment. So with regards to networks of supply, what would be your one big ask of the government's National Food Strategy? Let's start with you, Julia.
Okay. All right, well, I suppose it's, that there's this promise of 50% of food on the public plate to be local and or sustainable by the end of this Parliament. And I think what, for me, the National Food Strategy needs to have is a roadmap to how we get there. It's a really brilliant promise, but I just don't see how, at the moment, how government is going to take us on that journey. It's, we've got the what, it's the how. And I think some of that how has to build on what Patrick was saying. It's how do you make the finances of it work? And clearly public health is one of those big costs that government needs to be thinking about, how they can flip that around and see food as part of that solution. And actually I was reading Katie's report. I'll just hold it up. So tons of change. I think you put in here that for adding 3p to a school meal would enable all of those school meals to include 2 portions of organically grown vegetables for 3p per meal. And obviously, that adds up over the thousands. But if you can justify that against the enormous public health benefit and that huge nutritional value of organically grown veg, I think that's what I want to see. It's got to be about the finances. We've got to make the money work. And, all these strategies are great if it's like nice ideas, but please make the money add up.
Thanks, Katie.
For me, I think it's about how we support, enable, and continue to grow the fantastic work that's already going on at a local level. There's, as I said, this network of food partnerships across the UK that need to be supported, resourced, valued, enabled to do some of the really difficult things which would need to be done around things like planning and the infrastructure that needs to go into place. Local food partnerships know what infrastructure is needed in their local area and can help coordinate that. And that's something that is happening in Wales, and Welsh Government have recognised that. So it would be good to see that kind of happening at a national level. I'm also very interested to know how the National Food Strategy will dovetail at a UK level, how that will dovetail with devolved nations, and how that works with policies that are devolved in Northern Ireland and Scotland and Wales will be interesting too.
Yeah, I mean, obviously public procurement is this fantastic potential driver for change that has never delivered in the UK, and yet it's delivered in other parts of the world, Copenhagen being a fantastic example of the transformation that can happen when you connect demand from the public sector through to agriculture, and that affects a cultural change, which means people change the way they eat at home. Amazing if we could make that happen. I think the food strategy needs to be really brave about regulatory frameworks, that we need to just say, let's have some regulation that says we have to do some things. And let's make sure that it says we eat more minimally processed whole foods and that we incentivize both their production and their consumption through regulation and incentive.
Brilliant. Big up for regulation.
I agree. I think a quote from Lady Eve Balfour, who called agriculture the primary health service. So government should get out of the silos. There should be a meeting between Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves and Wes Streeting, and the exam question should be, how can we spend a greater proportion of the taxpayers' money on promoting, producing and distributing healthy food, rather than spending 75 times more on treating disease which is caused by unhealthy food. And if we could get the government to do that, then change would happen.
Fantastic. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to you for coming. Enjoy the rest of the festival.